When Charles Walker appeared at a small out-of-state hospital on a freezing cold evening, he was barely recognizable, gaunt to the point where his skin clung to his bones, his eyes hollow and empty, and in his pocket, just one phone that didn't belong to him. The man had vanished 9 months earlier, during what seemed like a harmless day hike at Zion National Park, where he was presumed to have died in the harsh wilderness. But what truly chilled the doctors and police wasn't the fact that Charles was still alive. The most terrifying part was what he wouldn't say, the erased stretches of memory, and the signs that someone had decided his life for him. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On an early morning at Zion National Park, the parking lot next to the trailhead for a popular day hiking route stood in the characteristic quiet of the park before peak hours, when the sun was still low and the tall sandstone cliffs cast long shadows across the hard, dry ground. Charles Walker closed his car door and paused for a few seconds, as if committing the surroundings to memory, a small habit often seen in solo hikers, before stepping into vast natural terrain. Charles was no stranger to outdoor activities, but this trip carried clear personal significance when he chose to visit the park alone, not joining any group, not meeting anyone, treating the short day hike as a completely separate block of time, where he could be fully in control of his route and schedule, with plans to return to the parking lot before dark, at the exact time he'd told his family. According to hikers present around the same time, Charles looked exactly like a typical day visitor, planning to go and return in one day. No tent, no overnight gear, just a light backpack holding water, snacks, and essentials for a few hours on the trail, clothing appropriate for the weather and terrain, no signs of preparing for a longer or high-risk journey. Before stepping onto the path, Charles took time to double-check his planned route on a paper map and handheld GPS device, cross-referencing the out-and-back distance with the remaining daylight hours, then adjusted his backpack straps, retied his shoelaces, and started walking with a steady, unhurried pace, showing no rush or hesitation. Security cameras at the trailhead area, along with confirmation from several hikers behind him, recorded Charles passing through the trail entrance in completely normal condition, no notable interaction with anyone else, and no signs of disorientation, marking the last time he was definitively seen in the park's public space. According to the plan Charles had shared beforehand, this hike was expected to wrap up by late afternoon, early enough for him to return to the parking lot while the area was still lit and ranger patrols hadn't ended yet. For many hours after that, his absence didn't immediately raise alarm, because minor delays are fairly common with solo treks. However, as the planned end time passed, light in the canyons began fading quickly, and the parking lot gradually emptied of departing vehicles. Charles's car remained motionless in its original spot, with no sign of preparing to leave. Calls and messages from family went unanswered. There was no information suggesting he had changed plans or left the park by other means, and this prolonged silence slowly crossed the normal threshold of waiting for a day hike. When full darkness fell and trail visibility became poor, concern turned into concrete action, forcing Charles's loved ones to contact the park rangers to report that he had not returned as scheduled, officially marking the moment a seemingly routine trek at Zion turned into an unusual disappearance right from those very first hours, with no clear signs to explain his sudden vanishing from the predetermined route. Right after the rangers received the report that Charles Walker had not returned to the parking lot as scheduled, the National Park Service's search and rescue protocol was activated according to standard operating procedure for an overdue case without clear signs of death. The initial focus was on confirming the individual's identity, vehicle, planned route, and the last time frame he was seen at Zion National Park. Overnight rangers conducted a preliminary check of the trailhead area, parking lot, and the initial sections of the trail within safe reach, under diminishing light, while quickly reviewing security camera footage to confirm that Charles had indeed entered the trail and had not returned the same way, thereby ruling out the possibility that he had simply changed plans and left without notifying anyone. When the next day arrived, the official search operation expanded with the involvement of the park's dedicated search and rescue team. The search area was clearly divided into zones based on terrain, slope, vegetation, and previously documented hazard points in accident records, including narrow trail sections along cliff edges, natural fissures, loose talus slopes prone to sliding, and unofficial side paths that hikers sometimes accidentally wander onto. Each zone was assigned to ground search teams tasked with looking for footprints, skid marks, dropped items, or any signs suggesting an accident from a fall, exhaustion, or disorientation might have occurred. Meanwhile, another group interviewed hikers who had passed through the area during the relevant time window to gather additional information about whether anyone had seen Charles after the last confirmed sighting. In parallel with the ground teams, helicopters were deployed for aerial search flights following fan-shaped patterns, concentrating on areas difficult to reach on foot, where overhead visibility could spot a human body, bright-colored clothing, or any unusual signs on the terrain surface. While K9 units were brought in at the last point, Charles was seen to sniff for scent and determine his possible direction of travel after leaving the trailhead. Throughout the process, every potential sign was documented and cross-checked among the teams, but the findings did not align with the scenario of a typical accident. No skid marks were found, no evidence of a fall from a cliff, no backpack, water bottle, or any personal items belonging to Charles were discovered left on the trail, and there were no signs indicating he had attempted to turn back in an emergency. As the search perimeter continued to expand into adjacent areas, including connecting trails and unofficial paths created by locals, the results remained unchanged. Every route checked showed no evidence of Charles's continued presence after the initial time frame, making the possibility that he had been injured and was lying somewhere within the search area increasingly difficult to explain. Notably, throughout the entire search effort, search and rescue personnel recovered no criminal evidence whatsoever, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damaged gear, and no environmental disturbance, indicating third-party involvement. This kept the case classified as a missing person of undetermined cause, rather than a criminal incident from the outset. After many days of continuous high-intensity deployment under weather and terrain conditions that permitted it, the search campaign gradually reached its practical limits. Every reasonably possible area had been thoroughly checked without yielding a definitive result, leaving a significant gap between what would be expected in a routine trekking accident and the reality of the complete absence of any sign that Charles had met with misfortune within the park boundaries. A gap that, despite the search being conducted according to proper procedure and with full resources, still could not provide a clear explanation for his disappearance. After many days of high-intensity search deployment, without yielding any decisive results, the authorities at Zion National Park were forced to reassess the entire search and rescue campaign. On-site commanders reviewed the covered areas, cross-referenced the search zone maps with terrain data and environmental conditions at the time. Charles Walker went missing, ultimately concluding that every reasonably likely area had been thoroughly checked according to National Park Service standards. The decision to scale back the search was not made hastily, but proceeded step by step. First, withdrawing ground search teams from zones that had been swept multiple times with no new signs detected, terminating periodic helicopter flights once aerial observation no longer provided added value, and finally, halting the deployment of K9 units when scent trails from the last point Charles was seen failed to lead to any definite direction of travel. In the compiled reports, the search team emphasized that no body was found, no scraps of clothing, personal items, or biological traces that could be directly linked to a death scenario within the park boundaries. Evidence that typically surfaces in trekking accident cases involving falls, exhaustion, or prolonged disorientation. The complete absence of such proof made determining the cause exceptionally difficult. Although the possibility that Charles suffered an accident and ended up in an extremely inaccessible location could not be entirely ruled out, authorities also acknowledged that no on-the-ground indicators supported this hypothesis, and every scenario put forward remained speculative rather than evidence-based. When the large-scale search operation was officially terminated, Charles Walker's case file was shifted from active search status to legal and administrative review. The involved agencies now had to confront a familiar yet always heavy reality: in prolonged missing persons cases, no proof confirming survival, and no proof confirming death. After a mandated period of time, when all additional search efforts produced no new information, the case was classified at the record level as presumed dead, an administrative term that does not equate to confirming Charles had died, but rather reflects that, under current circumstances, there is no realistic basis to believe he is still alive or could return on his own, and maintaining a comprehensive search effort is no longer feasible. For Charles's family, this decision carried especially heavy weight, forcing them to face a state of unresolved loss, no body to bury, no clear cause to accept, and no definite timeline to bring closure. At the same time, it opened the necessary legal procedures regarding the missing person's identity and assets. In the months that followed, the family held personal and community memorial services, choosing to remember Charles as someone who vanished into the vast wilderness he had deliberately chosen to enter alone, rather than as the victim of a proven accident. These memorials took place in a quiet atmosphere, without the presence of any clear investigative conclusion to provide comfort or explanation. On the authorities' side, the entire file, from search reports, witness statements, camera data, and zone maps, was archived and moved to cold case status, meaning the matter was no longer treated as an emergency situation, but was fully preserved so it could be reopened if new information, fresh leads, or emerging evidence arose in the future. In internal notes, Charles Walker's disappearance was flagged as an atypical case due to the absence of elements commonly seen in either of the two main cause categories, accident or criminal act. It is precisely this ambiguity that made his file a quiet name on the list of unsolved missing persons cases, where every conclusion remains provisional and is built on the limits of what is known. 9 months after Charles Walker's disappearance was filed away in the archived cases, on what seemed like an ordinary evening at a frontline medical facility out of state, a man appeared in a condition that immediately put the entire emergency reception area on high alert. His gait was unsteady, as if he were about to collapse at any moment, his shoulders slumped heavily, his steps lacked strength, and his eyes were glazed and unfocused, not locking onto any fixed point, indicating exhaustion far beyond ordinary fatigue. According to the on-duty staff, the man had to practically cling to the reception counter to stay balanced. His breathing was labored and heavy, his voice hoarse and thick, coming in broken bursts that made initial communication extremely difficult, while his whole body gave off the smell of clothing that had been worn continuously for a long time without proper washing. When he was taken to the initial examination area, his vital signs showed his body was in clear and severe decline: irregular heart rate, low blood pressure, dry and cold skin, sluggish reflexes, along with signs pointing to prolonged dehydration and malnutrition, indicators that did not match someone who had endured just a few difficult days, but suggested a cumulative physical deterioration over an extended period. During the examination, doctors noticed he struggled to answer basic questions about the date, location, and current circumstances. He repeatedly confused time references, could not determine where he had been in the recent past, and was even unable to clearly describe the route that had brought him to the medical facility, symptoms consistent with disorientation in both space and time. What stood out was that the man carried no identification documents whatsoever, no wallet, no bank cards, no backpack or luggage, and none of the personal items typically associated with someone traveling independently, except for the clothes he was wearing, which were old, worn, and mismatched, as though pieced together from various sources rather than prepared as a single outfit for a journey. While checking his clothing for medical safety, staff discovered an old mobile phone in his jacket pocket, no protective case, screen heavily scratched, battery nearly dead. When they powered on the device to look for emergency contact information, they quickly realized that the account name, contacts, and stored data on the phone did not match the identity, the man was vaguely trying to provide. When asked about the origin of the phone, his response was slow. It took him a long time to think, and ultimately he only gave fragmented, incomplete answers that did not explain why he was carrying a device not registered in his name. He simply repeated that it was the only thing he still had when he left the place where he had been before. The presence of a phone that did not belong to its user, in the context of no identification papers and no other personal belongings, was immediately noted by medical staff as an unusual detail. In real-world experience, even patients with psychological disorders or temporary memory loss usually retain items tied to their personal identity, whereas here every familiar identifying marker was absent. During intake, the man showed sensitivity to loud sounds and bright lights, startling easily when someone approached unexpectedly, and he repeatedly shrank back when questioned about the recent past. Reactions that led doctors to suspect his condition was not merely physical exhaustion, but also involved prolonged psychological stress. When asked to provide contact information for family or friends, he took many minutes trying to recall, then offered incomplete names and numbers that could not be immediately verified, forcing the facility to activate the protocol for an unidentified patient, which included creating a temporary record and notifying local authorities as required by regulation. In the initial medical notes, the intake team observed that the man's mental state did not resemble an acute sudden psychotic episode, but rather the aftermath of a long period of deprivation of stability, where both body and mind had been eroded over time, resulting in diminished capacity for self-care, self-orientation, and self-protection. When law enforcement arrived to work with the hospital, they could only gather very limited information because the man's health condition did not allow for any in-depth exchange, and all on-site verification efforts were hampered by the lack of documents, lack of clear identifying data, and the vagueness in his speech. In that context, the man's file was recorded in a temporary status, with the immediate priority placed on medical stabilization and ensuring short-term safety, while the parties involved began to realize that this was not a routine emergency case, but one with multiple overlapping unusual signs: severe physical emaciation, disorientation, complete absence of identification and luggage, and possession of a phone that did not belong to him. All combining to form a picture that was not immediately explainable, where the man's appearance seemed tied to a prolonged gap in the past. At that moment, though, his true identity and story still remained unclear. After the man's medical condition had been stabilized to the point where basic verification procedures could be carried out, the medical facility coordinated with local authorities to initiate a layered identification process. It began with collecting biometric data for cross-checking against national missing persons databases. Fingerprints were taken under strict controlled conditions and submitted for analysis, while facial photographs were captured according to identification standards for comparison with archived records. The initial cross-check results did not produce an immediate match due to the man's dramatically altered appearance compared to older photos, including severe weight loss, uncontrolled beard and hair growth, and signs of premature aging from prolonged stress, forcing the verification team to expand the search to more time-stable identification methods. In the next step, dental records were gathered by taking X-rays and documenting detailed tooth structure, fillings, wear patterns or prior dental interventions, then compared against dental data of individuals classified as missing for many months or years, a process that often takes time due to data being scattered across different states and healthcare providers. In parallel, biological samples were collected for DNA testing, a decisive confirmatory step in complex identification cases, especially when no identification documents or reliable statements from the subject himself are available. While awaiting results, authorities reviewed the list of missing persons files matching approximate age, gender, and context. The case of Charles Walker, who had gone missing at Zion National Park and been classified as presumed dead, quickly rose to the priority group due to matches in estimated height, eye color, and certain physical characteristics noted in the original file. When the dental results came back, several key details, such as filling locations and jaw structure, showed a high degree of similarity to Charles's records. Although not yet sufficient for a final conclusion, they were enough to strengthen the hypothesis that the man receiving treatment was the same individual who had vanished without a trace many months earlier. The decisive confirmation came from the DNA test results. The biological sample from the man showed a clear match with the stored DNA data of Charles Walker, eliminating all remaining doubt about his identity, and officially confirming that the person who had appeared in a state of extreme emaciation at the out-of-state medical facility was indeed Charles, the same person who had been presumed no longer able to return after the search campaign was terminated. Immediately after identity confirmation, the notification protocol was followed to standard. Authorities contacted Charles's family through official channels, preparing them psychologically and providing information step by step to avoid sudden shock. The situation of someone previously classified as presumed dead, suddenly being confirmed alive, is extremely rare and carries complex emotional consequences. The notification took place in the context of Charles's family, having spent many months living with the assumption of irreversible loss, so their initial reaction was a mixture of stunned disbelief, skepticism, and overwhelming emotion when told that Charles was still alive, but in serious physical and mental condition, requiring time to recover before any direct reunion could occur. On the investigative side, confirming his identity immediately triggered a new chain of administrative and legal procedures. Charles's missing persons file was pulled from passive archive status and moved to reopened status, meaning all prior data from search and rescue reports, witness statements, to temporary conclusions, was brought back to the analysis table. Reopening the cold case was not just about updating the victim's living status, it also created an urgent need to re-examine all initial assumptions. Charles's return in a state of emaciation, combined with the accompanying unusual details, indicated that his disappearance could not be explained simply by an accident or getting lost. In internal memos, the case was flagged as a rare exception. A file previously closed on the search front now had to be reopened in an entirely different direction. This required coordination among multiple units, from medical, forensic, to federal and state investigative agencies, to clarify what had happened during the period when Charles had not appeared in any surveillance system or communication network. Although at the time of identity confirmation, the authorities still could not offer any conclusions about the cause or circumstances behind Charles's prolonged disappearance, officially establishing that he was alive fundamentally changed the nature of the case. It forced a file once archived as an unresolved conclusion to return to active investigation status, now grounded in the premise that the time Charles was missing was not a random void, but a real sequence of events that had tangible impacts on his body, mind, and every related fact, thereby demanding a complete restructuring of the investigative approach based on the victim's confirmed survival. In that context, right after the case file was reopened, the initial taking of statements was implemented in a cautious and step-by-step manner, with absolute priority given to medical and psychological stability before seeking detailed information. Both the medical team and investigators determined that Charles was not yet in a condition to withstand the pressure of a standard interrogation process without exacerbating the already documented signs of trauma. In the first exchanges, his statements were fragmented, disjointed, and lacking chronological order, clearly reflecting the previously noted disorientation. Charles could recall very small details, like the feeling of light in a room or a familiar repeating sound, but he was unable to accurately determine how long he had been missing, could not answer questions about the number of days, weeks, or even months that had passed since the last time he clearly remembered stepping onto the trail. Every effort by investigators to establish a rough timeline yielded no reliable results, as Charles continually mixed up periods, sometimes believing he had only been gone a few days, other times appearing confused when reminded of a stretch lasting many months, and this reaction did not resemble deliberate concealment, but rather the consequence of a large perceptual gap where the concept of time had been severely eroded or distorted. When asked about where he had been during the entire period of disappearance, Charles tended to avoid the topic, change the subject, or respond with vague descriptions not tied to any specific location, for instance, talking about an enclosed space, dim light, or a feeling of restricted movement, but he would stop immediately when questions got closer to an actual place or geographic context. Each time this happened, observers noted a marked change in his body language, clenched hands, faster breathing, averted eyes, indicating a sharp increase in stress when the subject was raised. Notably, during some exchanges, when a specific name was mentioned as part of reviewing Charles's past relationships, his reaction became more pronounced, full body tension, prolonged silence, and sometimes a brief but intense emotional outburst that forced investigators to pause the conversation. Although Charles did not directly confirm that individual's role in his story, this reaction was recorded as a significant indicator of a deeply stressful connection, distinct from the general confusion he showed on other topics. Throughout the initial statements, one of the most troubling points for investigators was Charles's inability to provide a reasonable explanation for the phone he had with him when he appeared at the medical facility. When asked about the device's origin, his answers were contradictory, sometimes saying it was given to him, other times claiming he found it, but he could not describe the specific circumstances or timing of receiving the phone, and he was even less able to explain why it was the only item he still had while all other identification and personal belongings had vanished. Investigators observed that whenever questions turned to the phone, Charles tended to withdraw, speak more slowly, and often end his answers with incomplete phrases, as if he himself was uncertain about the memories tied to the item, or was not ready to confront its significance. Taken together, the initial statement sessions painted a picture full of gaps. Events could not be arranged in a clear chronological sequence, locations were not specifically identified, and relationships only emerged through emotional reactions, rather than direct narration. This forced investigators to accept that Charles's statements could not be treated as a complete account of what happened, but only as scattered fragments reflecting the psychological state of someone who had just returned from a period of total loss of control. In internal reports, authorities noted explicitly that the absence of timelines, the avoidance when referring to where he had been, the tense reactions to a specific individual, and the helplessness in explaining the phone should not be hastily interpreted as lack of cooperation. Instead, they needed to be viewed in the context of severe psychological and cognitive trauma, requiring a more cautious approach if those gaps were to be filled without causing further harm to the victim. It was precisely the existence of those gaps that made the initial statements a necessary but severely limited step, one where every piece of information obtained had to be carefully weighed between investigative value and the risk of applying excessive pressure on someone still in the process of recovery. After the initial statements were taken, with many gaps that could not yet be filled, the focus shifted to systematically building a forensic medical profile to objectively assess Charles Walker's condition. Forensic doctors, nutrition specialists, and rehabilitation experts collaborated to analyze all clinical data collected from the moment he appeared at the medical facility until his condition had stabilized further. The first and most striking result was evidence of prolonged malnutrition, shown by a body mass index significantly lower than in his pre-disappearance medical records, sharply reduced fat and muscle mass percentages, and blood tests revealing deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals needed for normal bodily function. These indicators did not align with a short-term fasting period or voluntary dieting, but reflected a chronic state of malnutrition lasting long enough to cause widespread effects on the immune system and recovery capacity. In parallel, assessments of the musculoskeletal system revealed cumulative muscle, joint injuries in Charles, including atrophy in major muscle groups due to lack of movement, persistent joint pain, not linked to sports injuries or single accidents, and restricted range of motion in certain joints, particularly the shoulders and hips, signs commonly seen in individuals forced to maintain disadvantageous postures or restricted movement over extended periods. Orthopedic specialists noted that this pattern of injury differed from what is typically observed in people surviving in the wilderness. In genuine survival cases, the body usually sustains acute injuries, abrasions, sprains, or fractures from rough terrain, whereas here the damage was silent and gradual, more consistent with a context of confined space and limited mobility. Another key finding came from tests and observations related to long-term lack of light exposure. Charles showed severe vitamin D deficiency, abnormally pale skin, relative to the expected sun exposure, for someone presumed to have been moving outdoors, along with sleep disturbances and disrupted circadian rhythms, signs that frequently appear in individuals confined to low-light environments or deprived of direct natural sunlight for prolonged periods. Doctors emphasized that even wilderness hikers or extreme survivors routinely receive sun exposure, whereas Charles's profile indicated a prolonged deficiency difficult to explain by an outdoor survival scenario. When synthesizing this data, the forensic team compared it against documented natural survival models from previous missing persons cases, including getting lost in the woods, living off natural food sources, or temporary shelter, and determined that Charles's medical profile did not match any of those patterns. There were no signs of prolonged exposure to environmental elements, such as sun, wind, or insects, nor the typical injuries from continuous movement over rugged terrain. Instead, the overall medical picture depicted a body maintained in a state of controlled deprivation, food intake insufficient to sustain health, but enough to prolong life, movement restricted enough to cause muscle atrophy, but not to the point of acute injury, and light exposure limited long enough to produce clear biochemical changes. In the conclusion reports, forensic experts recorded that the combination of prolonged malnutrition, cumulative muscle, joint damage, long-term light deprivation signs, and the reasonable exclusion of natural survival scenarios formed a consistent chain of medical indicators pointing toward a context in which Charles had been confined or tightly controlled in an enclosed space for an extended period, rather than freely moving in the natural environment. Notably, this conclusion was not based on a single sign, but resulted from linking multiple independent data points, each of which might lack sufficient weight alone, but when placed together created a clear and difficult to refute pattern. While the doctors refrained from making judgments about motive or the identity of any involved party, they asserted that, from a forensic medical perspective, Charles's condition could not be reasonably explained by assuming he had survived independently in the wild throughout the period of disappearance. The assessment of prolonged confinement was documented as an expert evaluation grounded in clinical evidence, serving as the foundation for redirecting the entire case approach from a medical standpoint toward a more complex context, one in which the harm to Charles's body reflected a period of existence under controlled conditions, leaving profound and long-lasting consequences far beyond what could be observed with the naked eye. In parallel with completing the forensic medical profile, a team of forensic psychologists was assigned to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of Charles Walker's mental state to clarify the behavioral and emotional manifestations recorded during the initial contacts. Right from the first assessment sessions, the experts identified a cluster of symptoms consistent with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested through exaggerated startle responses to sudden sounds, a state of hypervigilance even in safe environments, sleep interrupted by unspecified nightmares, and persistent anxiety when faced with questions that evoked the missing period. Standardized tests revealed Charles had difficulty regulating emotions, frequently falling into states of emotional numbness, or conversely, sudden anxiety outbursts when placed in situations that triggered memories. These reactions were not transient or dramatic, but appeared consistently, reinforcing the conclusion that they were the consequence of prolonged trauma rather than a single event. A particularly emphasized factor in the psychological report was the presence of submissive reflexes. Charles tended to wait for instructions even in situations where he had full decision-making rights, repeatedly sought confirmation that he was doing things correctly, and showed clear hesitation when encouraged to express personal opinions, a behavioral pattern commonly seen in individuals accustomed to being controlled and punished for stepping outside permitted boundaries. During sessions, when the expert deliberately shifted to an open, non-directive structure, Charles initially appeared confused and disoriented, indicating he had adapted to an environment where personal agency was severely restricted, and this adaptation continued to affect how he interacted with others, even in the absence of direct threat. The evasive behavior during statements was analyzed by the experts as a defense mechanism rather than lack of cooperation. Whenever the conversation approached content related to where he had been or specific interactions during the missing time, Charles tended to change the subject, respond with vague generalities, or suddenly fall silent, accompanied by physiological stress signs such as increased heart rate and rapid breathing, indicating that direct confrontation with these memories could trigger a strong traumatic response. Notably, this avoidance was not uniform across all topics, but concentrated on content implying power relationships and control. This allowed the experts to rule out feigning or deliberate evasion for personal motives, as Charles's reactions matched documented patterns in victims of prolonged captivity or psychological control. When placing Charles's behavioral and emotional manifestations into a broader context, the forensic psychology team found a high degree of alignment with the prolonged control model, where victims gradually develop psychological survival strategies, such as compliance, minimization of personal expression, and avoidance of negative attention, strategies that may help maintain safety in a captive environment, but become barriers upon returning to normal life. The experts emphasized that the combination of PTSD diagnosis, submissive reflexes, avoidance behavior, and other supporting signs formed a consistent psychological picture that would be difficult to explain based solely on a lost-in-the-wilderness or natural survival scenario. In those cases, victims typically exhibit heightened autonomy and assertiveness to cope with harsh conditions, the opposite of the withdrawal and submissiveness observed in Charles. Based on the assessment results, the forensic psychology team issued recommendations for safe information gathering methods, stressing the avoidance of confrontational interrogation techniques or pressure, and instead advocating short, clearly structured sessions that allowed Charles to control the pace and depth of sharing, thereby reducing the risk of re-traumatization and increasing the likelihood of sustainable information retrieval. The experts also proposed close coordination between investigators and therapists, ensuring that every effort to obtain statements was weighed alongside the victim's psychological recovery needs, as any excessive pushing could worsen existing symptoms and cause Charles to withdraw further. In the report's conclusion, the forensic psychological evaluation was determined to serve not only as an investigative support tool, but also as indirect evidence reflecting the environment Charles had endured, one where prolonged control left deep imprints on how he thought, reacted, and interacted. It was precisely these imprints, when systematically analyzed, that helped strengthen the determination that Charles's missing period was tied to an experience of strict control, requiring a cautious and humane approach in the process of uncovering the truth. When the investigative focus shifted to physical evidence capable of providing objective data, the phone that Charles Walker carried when he appeared at the medical facility was identified as the central piece of evidence and processed according to standard digital forensic procedures, beginning with sealing the device, documenting its external physical condition, and extracting basic hardware parameters. Examination of the SIM and device revealed that the phone's IMEI number did not match any device Charles had ever registered or used before his disappearance. Meanwhile, the SIM card inserted in the phone had been activated under someone else's name, with subscriber information, registered address, and payment method completely unrelated to Charles. Cross-referencing with carrier data confirmed that this SIM had been kept active continuously for many months, with no interruptions corresponding to the time Charles went missing, indicating the device was not newly activated recently or a temporary phone. Deep analysis of the device's internal storage showed a large amount of data had been deleted, but not in the pattern of a full factory reset. Instead, it was selective deletion targeting specific categories, such as call history, messages, and location data during certain time periods, while other system data remained intact. This selective deletion was determined to be inconsistent with random software errors or accidental actions by an uninformed user, as the data gaps appeared consistent and repetitive. Data recovery tools enabled partial restoration of deleted information, revealing abnormally interrupted activity logs, The device recorded regular use before and after the gaps, but was completely empty of data during prolonged periods, creating a pattern inconsistent with normal phone usage habits. Usage history analysis showed the phone was primarily used for basic functions like making and receiving short calls and checking minimal information, with very few signs of common personal apps being used, a mismatch with Charles's pre-disappearance mobile device usage profile, which indicated frequent use for social communication and online activities. Network connection data showed the device frequently connected to the same group of cell towers over long periods, with very little variation in relative location, contrary to the multi-point movement patterns typical of someone moving freely or surviving in the wild. These repeated connections suggested the phone had operated within a geographically limited area, where coverage range did not change significantly over time. In the contacts and call history, experts discovered a group of phone numbers that appeared with high frequency and were contacted repeatedly on a cyclical basis, but none matched any personal relationships of Charles documented in family, friends, or colleague records. When cross-checked against public data and federal records, these numbers led to another individual who had an indirect past connection to Charles, even though this person had never been mentioned in the initial search reports. Notably, these contacts appeared consistently in the phone's usage history, even in sections where other data had been deleted, indicating they held a special role in the device's usage process. User behavior analysis through system settings, interface language, and data organization showed signs of a primary user long familiar with the device, exhibiting consistent operational habits, contradicting the hypothesis that Charles had only recently accessed and used this phone for a short time. When compared to Charles's device usage behavior before his disappearance, the differences were stark, reinforcing the conclusion that the phone was not his personal device. Another noted factor was that the device contained no personal photos, documents, or data tied to Charles's identity, something rare for a phone used as a primary device over an extended period. The remaining data was mostly functional or related to the aforementioned contacts, further highlighting the absence of personal customization traces. During the examination, experts also noted that the exact point when Charles began appearing in the device's usage could not be clearly determined from the remaining data, as the selectively deleted gaps obscured the transition phase between the primary user and the time Charles held the phone. This made the phone a source of information that was both rich in data and full of voids, where every digital trace needed to be interpreted in overall context, rather than in isolation. All results from the SIM check, device examination, deleted data recovery, abnormal usage history, and communication links were meticulously documented in the digital forensic report, creating an independent profile separate from Charles's statements, one that reflected a prolonged organized sequence of activity, not directly tied to his identity, thereby underscoring the phone's central role as evidence containing information about the missing period that the victim's memory and account could not fully provide. Based on the forensic data collected from the phone, the digital tracing process was implemented with an objective reconstruction of connection traces, independent of Charles Walker's still unstable statements. The initial step focused on analyzing the mobile network connection history and telecommunications data related to the SIM used in the device, including call connection logs, data transmission records, and timestamps when the device logged into the carrier's network. These records showed the phone maintained a relatively stable connection state over many months, with repeating daily and weekly activity cycles. There were no signs of continuous movement across multiple coverage areas, as typically seen with devices carried on long journeys or during free movement, instead showing prolonged attachment to a specific group of cell towers. Cell tower tracing was carried out by cross-referencing the cell tower identifier codes in the telecommunications logs with the carrier's geographic location data, thereby pinpointing the areas where the device frequently connected. The results indicated that for the majority of the time, the phone only appeared within the coverage range of a cluster of adjacent cell towers, with a limited operational radius that did not exceed the normal fluctuation range for someone living or staying fixed at one location. When connection timestamps were overlaid in chart form, analysts observed a consistent pattern. The device tended to show strong activity during fixed time slots each day and remained almost silent during the remaining periods. A characteristic inconsistent with free on-demand personal use and more resembling access granted only during permitted windows. The timestamp cross-referencing process also included comparing the phone's connection history against external events, such as weather conditions, network outages, or cell tower maintenance, in order to rule out the possibility that data gaps resulted from technical factors. The findings showed these gaps did not coincide with any recorded service interruptions, reinforcing the conclusion that they reflected controlled usage behavior rather than system errors. By combining connection data with cell tower information, the investigative team proceeded to identify the device's potential operational zone by delineating the intersection area of the cell towers it frequently connected to, thereby creating a map of the highest probability region where the device had operated over an extended period. This map revealed a relatively fixed geographic area that did not expand progressively over time, as would be typical in cases of continuous movement. Notably, this operational zone did not overlap with densely populated urban centers or major transportation hubs. Instead, it lay in an area with low fluctuation in connection density, where the number of cell towers was limited and coverage remained relatively stable, helping to rule out the possibility that the device was frequently carried through high-density urban zones with numerous towers. In the next step, the phone's usage timestamps were compared against the gaps in Charles's statements. Although there was no direct overlap with his personal recollections, the digital data revealed a continuous, uninterrupted activity sequence, indicating the device remained in a usable state at all times, contradicting the hypothesis that Charles had been completely cut off from all means of communication throughout his disappearance. The narrowing of the suspect area was achieved by progressively eliminating geographic regions inconsistent with the identified connection pattern, including zones with high cell tower density, major transportation corridors, and locations that frequently recorded connection changes due to movement. This elimination process helped focus attention on a few specific areas that simultaneously met the criteria of limited coverage range, connection stability, and reasonable distance from the location where Charles had originally gone missing. Throughout the digital tracing process, analysts emphasized that every conclusion was based on the convergence of multiple independent data sources, from connection history, cell tower locations, to time-based usage patterns, in order to minimize the risk of subjective inference from any single indicator. It was precisely this methodical approach that allowed them to gradually narrow the geographic area of interest, without relying directly on Charles's statements. The tracing results demonstrated that digital data could reconstruct a relatively clear operational space for the phone over a long period, thereby providing a solid evidentiary foundation for deeper analysis of the context in which the device existed, while remaining consistent with the medical and psychological profiles already documented for Charles, where every sign pointed toward a phase of controlled living within a geographically limited space, indirectly but persistently reflected through the invisible connections of telecommunications networks. Based on the established digital data, the process of eliminating unsuitable locations was implemented as a layered analytical sequence aimed at ruling out groups of spaces capable of leaving public or administrative traces, starting first with legally registered residential areas within the relevant coverage zone, where residency records, utility data, rental history, and activity density typically leave clear traces over time. When cross-referencing these residential areas with the phone's connection pattern, investigators noted a stark incompatibility between urban living rhythms and the stable, low-variation connection data. In legal residential environments, mobile devices frequently switch cell towers, record numerous nearby devices, and show clear day-night activity patterns, whereas the collected data exhibited prolonged technical monotony. Next, areas with high surveillance camera density were placed in the exclusion category, including commercial districts, public parking lots, major transportation routes, newly developed residential zones, and other semi-public spaces where human presence over an extended period would be nearly impossible to conceal without generating images. Reviews of camera data in these areas found no sequence of footage consistent with the continuous presence of an individual under restricted movement conditions. In parallel, officially registered accommodations such as hotels, motels, guest houses, licensed campgrounds, and tourist lodging facilities within the suspect radius were checked through registration logs, payment records, booking histories, and lodging tax reports. Even in cases involving cash payments or false identities, these establishments typically leave some operational traces, and the absence of any matching records further supported excluding this group of locations from consideration. Crowded public areas, such as shopping malls, local markets, entertainment districts, public parks, and community gathering spots were also analyzed for exclusion due to their common characteristics: high network interaction density, numerous simultaneous device activities, and constant changes in the radio environment, completely contrary to the data showing a device maintaining connection under low variation, near isolated conditions with almost no surrounding digital interactions. Beyond public factors, the elimination process also considered semi-official facilities, such as warehouses, small production workshops, registered business farms, and permitted auxiliary structures, places that often maintain transportation logs, utility bills, or work schedules capable of generating traces if a person were held there long-term. Cross-checking these records showed no matches with the established time pattern. The analysis continued to expand into temporary use areas, such as construction sites, material storage yards, and infrastructure project zones, where operations are typically cyclical and involve rotating personnel, and mismatch with the prolonged isolation pattern evident in the digital data. As successive layers of public, semi-public, and administrative spaces were ruled out, investigators focused attention on the remaining isolated areas, standalone structures outside residential planning, sparsely trafficked rural land parcels, infrequently used buildings not tied to legal residency purposes, places where maintaining an individual over a long period could occur without creating administrative records or surveillance imagery. These areas typically share common features: limited accessibility, distance from major transportation routes, obstructed lines of sight due to terrain or vegetation, and telecommunications coverage stable enough to sustain basic connectivity, but not dense enough to produce frequent tower handoffs. During the elimination process, geographic factors such as hilly or mountainous terrain, narrow valleys, rarely used dirt roads, and the presence of unregistered structures were evaluated alongside the digital data to ensure consistency between the physical space and the connection model. The locations remaining after this elimination process were no longer public or semi-public living spaces. Instead, they converged on characteristics of enclosure, social isolation, and lack of regular oversight, aligning with what had been documented in Charles's medical and psychological profiles, where signs of prolonged isolation, environmental stimulus poverty, and external control could exist quietly, without detection by standard regulatory mechanisms. On that basis, the process of pinpointing the detention location shifted to the step of specifically identifying physical spaces outside the official residency control system, focusing on unregistered residential structures that do not undergo periodic oversight by authorities and do not appear in population databases, thereby enabling the prolonged existence of a detention environment without leaving clear administrative traces. These structures include temporarily converted warehouses, seasonal cabins, disused old workshops, auxiliary buildings on private land, or constructions built for other purposes, but never updated with changed usage functions. The common characteristics of these locations are the lack of clear administrative addresses, no valid house numbers, no official lease contracts, and no generated residency records. Land use history in the suspect areas is often vague or discontinuous, shown by land registered for agricultural purposes or left vacant for long periods, yet exhibiting unofficial usage signs, such as gradually formed trails, infrequent vehicle entry-exit marks, or the stable presence of temporary power sources. When cross-referencing time series satellite imagery, investigators paid attention to subtle sustained changes, such as unchanged roofing, repeated signs of activity around a fixed structure, or the appearance of light-blocking objects, without corresponding construction records. Another key factor in the narrowing was the extremely low level of social exposure of the suspect locations, evidenced by their distance from residential areas, absence of nearby commercial activity, not lying along major transportation routes, and virtually no pedestrian or vehicle traffic. Such environments reduce the likelihood of detecting the prolonged presence of an individual held there, especially when movement is restricted and daily life occurs in enclosed spaces. These locations are often situated deep in rural areas, on the edges of public land, or tucked between large private land parcels, where control over access points can be maintained without drawing attention. Suitability for long-term isolation was assessed through the physical features of the structures, including the degree of natural light shielding, ability to block external views, relative soundproofing, and the existence of enclosed spaces sufficient to restrict movement. Structures without windows, with metal doors, semi-basement rooms, or areas separated from external living spaces, were considered compatible with maintaining prolonged isolation. Additionally, the site's basic self-sustainability was evaluated, including on-site water sources, capacity to store essentials, and minimum preservation conditions for forced living without frequent resupply. The narrowing was not based solely on physical factors, but was tightly aligned with digital data matches, where suspect locations had to fall within the stable coverage range of specific cell towers, with minimal signal strength variation. This pattern reflected a mobile device operating in a nearly fixed space, repeatedly connecting to the same tower over long periods without significant roaming. Geographic areas, such as narrow valleys, behind hills or behind dense forest strips, often produce such coverage characteristics, allowing the device to maintain basic connectivity while limiting fluctuations. The match also appeared in connection rhythms, consistent with a controlled environment, featuring short activity periods, interspersed with prolonged silences, reflecting device usage restricted by external factors. The narrowed locations showed no signs of collective digital activity, such as simultaneous presence of multiple devices or high data traffic during normal activity hours. Discrete accessibility of the location was an additional important criterion, including the existence of rarely used dirt roads, unofficial paths, or access by vehicle without passing through populated areas. This allowed the movement of people and supplies to occur without attracting attention from the surrounding community. The intersection of criteria, unregistered residential structures, opaque land use history, extremely low social exposure, capacity for long-term isolation maintenance, and close alignment with digital data, narrowed the investigation scope to a group of locations sharing distinct common characteristics, where human presence could be persistently concealed without leaving easily recognizable public or administrative traces. When the locations had been specifically identified, the on-site examination of the detention site was carried out to inspect each suspect space in the field, focusing on identifying traces of prolonged habitation that reflected the continuous presence of a single individual under conditions of restricted exposure to the external environment. This included the abnormal distribution of basic living items, a fixed sleeping area, repeated eating positions, and wear marks on floors and contact surfaces, indicating a gradually narrowing familiar range of movement over time. These signs were not temporary or random, but demonstrated forced adaptation to a limited space where daily activities followed fixed, unchanging paths. Although no direct physical restraint tools, such as handcuffs, iron chains, interior locks, or binding devices were found, the absence of such items did not undermine the assessment of control, because the spatial structure of the location showed the ability to restrict freedom of movement through architectural layout and environmental conditions. Entry and exit points were designed or modified in ways inconvenient for independent departure, including heavy doors that opened only from one side, steep or narrow staircases, and obstructed lines of sight that made orientation difficult. Spatial control was clearly evident through limited natural light, small or non-existent windows, and rudimentary but sufficient soundproofing surfaces to reduce the escape of sound outward, creating an enclosed environment where human presence was difficult to detect from outside. Indirect movement restriction was further reinforced by the geographic position of the structure, where the only access route was a rarely used dirt road or hard-to-observe path, making departure without assistance risky and likely to attract attention. During the examination, investigators noted the absence of the diverse activity signs typically found in voluntary residences. Instead, there was monotony in layout and function, indicating the occupant had no right to choose or alter the space according to personal needs. Wall and floor surfaces bore repeated contact marks at certain fixed positions, reflecting movement confined to a narrow familiar range, while other areas showed almost no signs of use. Evidence collection focused on elements reflecting prolonged habitation and indirect control, including old clothing with wear levels disproportionate to short-term use, a minimized number and variety of personal items, and household objects showing repeated use but lacking replacement. Biological samples collected from contact surfaces indicated the long-term presence of a single individual, with no signs of group activity or rotating users. In addition, investigators recorded the complete absence of personal decorative items, entertainment objects, or signs of space personalization, features common in voluntary residences, further reinforcing the conclusion of an imposed living environment. Movement restriction was also evident in the lack of personal transportation, maps, navigation devices, or tools to aid escape, while essential items were placed in easily reachable positions within the narrow range, showing that daily life was organized to sustain existence, but not to encourage freedom. Prolonged habitation traces also included accumulated dust and household waste at a stable level, but not exceeding thresholds that would indicate limited environmental care and dependence on others. The absence of direct physical restraint tools shifted analytical focus to more subtle control methods, where space and environmental conditions served as invisible, yet effective barriers, making it difficult for the detained person to leave even without being physically bound. Collected evidence was sealed and documented according to specific locations, to reflect the connection between spatial layout and behavioral patterns, thereby reconstructing a detention model based on isolation, restricted spatial awareness, and indirect control. What was recorded at the detention site not only reflected the victim's forced living conditions, but also revealed the existence of a durable control mechanism, one where space and living conditions were deliberately organized to maintain dependency, without resorting to visible violence, thereby raising the key question about the identity of the individual capable of establishing and sustaining this control structure over an extended period. From that requirement, the process of identifying suspect Raphael Moore proceeded by cross-layering information about actual control over the location, land use history, and independent access capability. Legal records and field data showed that Raphael was the owner, or held effective control over the area where the structure existed, with near-absolute decision-making power regarding access and use of the space over many years. Cadastral documents reflected that the land had seen no transfers or periodic inspections for years, enabling a structure to exist beyond routine oversight, while minor renovation and maintenance signs indicated regular management, and all indicators pointed to Raphael as the sole individual with long-term ties to the site. In parallel with the spatial control factor, Raphael's personal history displayed many signs of prolonged instability, including career disruptions, short-lived social relationships, a record of conflicts with colleagues and family, and controlling behaviors in previous personal relationships, reflecting a tendency to seek power in enclosed environments, and negative reactions when feeling threatened or losing control. Administrative records and indirect statements from people who had interacted with Raphael described him as reclusive, with few friends, prone to nurturing long-held resentment, and reluctant to let go of perceived losses caused by others, factors that helped form a psychological foundation conducive to prolonged retaliatory behavior. The connection between Raphael and Charles was established through documents related to a period of overlap in work and personal life, where a legal decision or action by Charles led to severe consequences for Raphael, including loss of income, collapse of personal plans, or rupture of an important relationship. Although the action was not intentionally harmful, Raphael viewed Charles as the direct cause of his ruined life. Indirect exchange traces and accounts from acquaintances showed Raphael had expressed deep bitterness about the matter, with accusatory and personalizing language that indicated unresolved, simmering resentment over time. The opportunity factor for accessing the victim was strengthened by Raphael's ability to be present in the Zion area at the time Charles disappeared, with a flexible daily schedule, unbound by fixed employment, and familiarity with the terrain that allowed him to move through low-traffic routes without drawing attention. Travel and mobility analyses showed Raphael possessed sufficient local knowledge to approach a solo day hiker in complex terrain, and the capability to remove that person from public space without leaving clear traces. Raphael's capacity for long-term detention was assessed through the combination of control over an isolated location, sufficient personal resources to sustain minimal living conditions, and a low social contact lifestyle, allowing provision of food, water, and other essentials infrequently yet adequately to maintain the life of a detained person, while minimizing detection risk by the surrounding community. Traces at the site showed a stable but impoverished activity pattern, consistent with forced prolonged survival, something difficult to achieve without an active, persistent, and planned controller, and Raphael was the only individual who fully met all these conditions. Raphael's behavioral profile also aligned with the indirect control model, documented at the detention site, one that did not require frequent physical violence, but relied on isolation, spatial control, information restriction, and gradual creation of dependency in the detained person, a method demanding patience and a tendency toward psychological manipulation. The synthesized analysis from ownership or control of the site, unstable personal history, direct and damaging connection to Charles, ability to access the victim under specific geographic conditions, and capacity to maintain a long-term detention space, formed a tightly logical structure in which Raphael Moore emerged as the individual, with sufficient motive, opportunity, and means to carry out prolonged detention in an isolated environment, reflecting the intersection of personal grudge, reclusive living circumstances, and durable spatial control capability. Raphael Moore's motive for revenge was formed from a chain of past events with a clear origin, but consequences that extended far beyond the initial scope. It began with a legal decision, or action, by Charles in a professional context where Raphael was directly involved. In his role as an expert, or with legal responsibility, Charles issued an assessment, report, or choice that caused a key activity of Raphael's to be suspended, terminated, or subjected to deeper investigation, leading to Raphael losing his job, and at the same time, the stable income that had been the pillar supporting his personal and family life. This event did not stop at economic loss, but triggered a chain reaction. Job loss brought prolonged financial pressure, unresolvable debts, and a rapid decline in Raphael's social standing within the community, where he once lived and worked. Raphael's family relationships began to fracture as economic and psychological stress exposed latent conflicts, leading to estrangement from loved ones, and ultimately, the breakdown of relationships that had once provided him emotional stability. In Raphael's perception, these losses were not the result of circumstances or his own chain of decisions, but were directly attributed to Charles as the sole cause, a psychological anchor on which to focus all dissatisfaction and failure, turning Charles into the symbol of the total collapse of the life Raphael had once built. The resentment therefore did not erupt immediately, but accumulated quietly over many years, nurtured in an increasingly deep context of social isolation. As Raphael gradually withdrew from relationships, with no outlets for counter-argument or emotional release, thoughts of retaliation developed in a distorted and increasingly extreme direction. During this process, Raphael did not seek dialogue or legal avenues to address the sense of injustice. Instead, he constructed an internal rationalization system in which control and punishment behaviors were seen as the only way to restore the lost sense of fairness. Raphael's goal from the beginning was not to kill Charles, because in his mind, death would end things too quickly and would not fully reflect the extent of the suffering Raphael believed he had endured. Instead, the desire was to prolong a state of dependency, forcing Charles to experience the feeling of loss of control, loss of freedom, and the gradual stripping away of the basic elements of life. Punishment through control became the central method, where Raphael sought psychological satisfaction by deciding the rhythm of Charles's life, his space, and his level of access to the outside world, creating a completely one-sided power relationship that Raphael could sustain over a long period. In this model, detention did not require continuous violence or lethal actions, but relied on spatial control, information restriction, and the creation of survival dependency, compelling Charles to adapt to conditions imposed by Raphael. The revenge motive was therefore deeply personal, not aimed at sending a message outward or achieving specific material gain, but focused on recreating the lost sense of power when Raphael had once felt judged, eliminated, and powerless to protect himself against the consequences of the past event. Behavioral analysis showed that Raphael viewed maintaining Charles's existence in a controlled state as a form of psychological balance, where each passing day that Charles could not be free served as living proof of the justified retribution Raphael believed in. The long-term accumulation of resentment also explains why Raphael could persistently maintain this control model over an extended period without seeking a quick end, because the very prolongation was the core objective of the behavior. In Raphael's distorted perception, controlling Charles was not only personal punishment, but also a way to reaffirm his own value, to prove that he still had the ability to dictate another person's fate, despite having previously lost his job, family, and social standing. The revenge motive therefore did not arise from a momentary impulse, but was the result of a prolonged collapse process, where the past event caused by Charles became the starting point for a continuous chain of losses. Resentment was nurtured in isolation, and the act of detention was chosen as the ultimate, but not instantly destructive form of punishment, reflecting a cold control-based revenge, built on prolongation and the victim's absolute dependency. The evidence cross-referencing process was implemented to place independent sources of information within the same analytical framework in order to check consistency and rule out the possibility of bias. It began with Charles's statements recorded under controlled medical and psychological conditions, where descriptions of the detention space, forced daily rhythm, restricted movement, and moments of contact with Raphael were gathered in fragmented segments, but showed recurring points of intersection, particularly descriptions of an enclosed structure, limited light, and the inability to freely access entry and exit points. These details were cross-referenced with digital data collected from the related mobile device, including connection history, cell tower locations, and prolonged periods of silence, revealing a usage pattern consistent with a fixed and controlled environment, where connectivity occurred unevenly and did not reflect free activity. When Charles's statements were placed alongside the digital data, investigators noted temporal matches between periods Charles described as having completely restricted access to the device, and the data gaps, while the brief periods of device activity corresponded to times Charles said he was permitted to use it under supervision. The detention site served as the third layer of cross-referencing, where physical features, such as spatial layout, prolonged habitation traces, the absence of direct physical restraint tools, and methods of indirect movement restriction, accurately mirrored what Charles described in his statements, from the fixed sleeping position to the limited movement range and the monotony of the living environment, where marks on the floor, repeated contact surfaces, and the distribution of living items at the site showed a spatial usage pattern consistent with the account of being forced to adapt to a narrow activity range over a long period. The central piece of evidence, the phone not registered to Charles, was brought into cross-referencing as a key link. Analyses showed the device's usage history, aligned with both the digital data and the statements, including selective data deletion, the absence of Charles's personal information, and traces related to another individual, reinforcing the conclusion that the device had been used as a communication control tool rather than a personal means. When placed within the site context, investigators noted that the device's storage location and preservation method matched descriptions of it being used only at specific times and not allowed to be kept long-term, reflecting an indirect control mechanism. The cross-referencing process also examined minor details in Charles's statements that had previously been assessed as fragmented or lacking clear timelines. When set against the digital data and the site, these details showed structural consistency, the vagueness about time aligned with an environment deprived of natural daily rhythms and external information. Minor discrepancies in the statements were explained by the victim's psychological and physical state, rather than signs of fabrication, especially since the core elements were corroborated by independent data sources. The cross-referencing extended to indirect factors, such as access capability to the location, spatial control rights, and the maintained activity pattern, showing alignment between Raphael's capacity and what was recorded from physical and digital evidence. When these layers of evidence were overlaid, they did not exist as disjointed pieces, but formed a logical chain of connections, where each source reinforced the others and minimized the possibility of random interpretation. Charles's statements provided the subjective experiential framework, digital data supplied objective traces of time and space, the detention site reflected specific physical conditions, and the central evidence linked these elements through the communication control mechanism. The evidence chain was completed by identifying key intersection points among the sources, where a detail repeated across multiple forms, from verbal accounts to data and physical traces, creating a proof structure with internal consistency. This process did not rely on any single decisive piece of evidence, but on the resonance of multiple independent sources, each with its own limitations, yet when combined producing a comprehensive picture of the detention behavior, reflecting deliberate prolonged control. The evidence chain was formed not from speculation, but from the repeated matches among the statements, digital data, the site, and the central piece of evidence. The legal proceedings were initiated after the authorities determined that the chain of evidence was sufficiently robust to move from investigation to prosecutorial enforcement. It began with the arrest of Raphael Moore, under a legally approved warrant, based on his actual control over the detention site, his direct connection to Charles, and the alignment between the statements, digital data, and on-site traces. The arrest was conducted cautiously, to avoid the risk of confrontation or evidence destruction, reflecting an assessment that Raphael tended toward behavioral control and was more likely to respond with manipulation than direct violence. After being taken into custody, Raphael entered the standard interrogation process, where he quickly advanced his central argument that Charles had stayed at the detention location voluntarily and could have left at any time. This claim aimed to deny the element of coercion and weaken the legal composition of unlawful detention. Investigators focused on rebutting this point by requiring Raphael to specifically explain Charles's access to entry and exit points, his right to use communication devices, his possession of identification documents, and his ability to move independently over the extended period. Raphael's answers revealed internal contradictions and failed to reasonably explain why Charles had not appeared in any administrative records, surveillance systems, or social interactions if he truly had freedom. The interrogation also directly confronted Raphael's statements with physical evidence from the site, where the spatial structure, activity layout, and absence of conditions for voluntary residency showed an environment organized to limit choices and create dependency, something incompatible with the legal concept of voluntariness. Proof of unlawful detention was built on the argument that coercion does not require visible restraints or frequent physical violence, but can exist through spatial control, information restriction, deprivation of communication means, and the creation of survival dependency. These elements were corroborated by the medical records reflecting prolonged emaciation, psychological evaluations showing submissive reflexes, and digital data demonstrating a controlled usage pattern. Prosecutors emphasized that theoretical ability to leave does not equate to actual freedom, especially when the victim was in a state of physical debilitation, disorientation, and prolonged psychological impact, making self-escape from the detention environment unfeasible. thereby completely undermining Raphael's voluntary claim. When these factors were presented systematically, Raphael's initial defense argument gradually lost persuasiveness because it could not reconcile with the consistent, independent evidence from multiple sources. Due to the seriousness and scope of the conduct, the case was determined to fall under federal jurisdiction, considering the prolonged detention violated federally protected individual liberty rights, the potential crossing of state lines, and the use of communication means within federal infrastructure, allowing for the application of stricter provisions than local prosecution. Federal prosecution enabled the mobilization and consolidation of evidence from various agencies, including local law enforcement, federal investigative units, digital forensic experts, and forensic psychologists, to build a comprehensive file fully reflecting the nature of the alleged conduct. During preparation for prosecution, prosecutors focused on perfecting the indictment by arranging the evidence in logical sequence, from control over the location, personal motive, opportunity to access the victim, method of detention, to the physical and psychological consequences for Charles. Aiming to prove that Raphael's conduct was not the result of misunderstanding or ambiguous circumstances, but a deliberate, sustained chain of actions. The case file was transferred for trial after all pretrial procedures were completed, with all documents, physical evidence, and statements standardized and sealed as required, ensuring that the file presented to the court fully reflected both the factual and legal aspects of the matter. When the investigation and prosecution procedures were finalized, the central issue of the case no longer revolved around the circumstances of Charles's disappearance or the hypotheses previously raised, but focused on clearly establishing the degree of Raphael's criminal responsibility for the prolonged unlawful detention, based on an evidence system that had been thoroughly reviewed, cross-referenced, and strengthened through multiple layers of independent analysis, sufficient to advance the file to the trial phase under federal jurisdiction. In that context, the trial at the federal court opened with a complete case file, where prosecutors presented the chain of evidence in logical sequence to clarify the legal nature of the conduct. Raphael Moore had carried out over an extended period, asserting that this was a deliberate detention model based on spatial and psychological control, rather than a misunderstanding or voluntary situation, as the defense had argued. During the trial, the federal court carefully examined the physical evidence from the site, digital data, medical records, and psychological evaluations, while also hearing Charles's testimony under witness protection conditions, thereby making clear that the absence of direct violence did not equate to the absence of coercion, as individual liberty could be deprived through isolation, information restriction, and the creation of survival dependency. A key focus of the trial was confirming Raphael's revenge motive, where documents and indirect statements showed the detention stemmed from a past event for which Raphael assigned responsibility to Charles, resulting in job loss, family breakdown, and collapse of social standing. Although that event was not criminal in nature, Raphael had personalized its consequences and nurtured resentment over a long period, turning it into the central driving force for prolonged controlling behavior. The jury determined that this motive existed not merely at an emotional level, but had been transformed into planned action, evidenced by the choice of an isolated location, maintenance of minimal living conditions, and control over access to information, demonstrating preparation and intent to sustain the conduct over time. In evaluating the nature of the conduct, the court concluded that Raphael had carried out prolonged unlawful detention, seriously violating Charles's individual liberty rights, with the constituent elements clearly proven, including control over the place of residence, restriction of realistic ability to leave, deprivation of communication means, and creation of a psychological environment, rendering the victim incapable of autonomy. The judges emphasized that federal law does not require the presence of handcuffs or physical violence to establish detention, rather it focuses on how and for how long the right to liberty was actually deprived. In this case, the extended duration combined with the degree of control was regarded as a clear aggravating factor. In the sentencing phase, the federal court sentenced Raphael Moore to 35 years in prison, reflecting the assessment that the prolonged detention not only caused severe physical and psychological harm to the victim, but also violated the foundational values of federal law concerning human rights and individual liberty. This sentence was determined after fully considering all aggravating factors, including the deeply personal revenge motive, deliberate preparation, the extended duration of the conduct, and the long-term consequences for Charles, while mitigating factors raised by the defense, such as difficult personal circumstances, lack of serious prior convictions, or arguments about voluntariness, were examined and rejected. The court held that Raphael's difficult circumstances could not justify depriving another person of liberty over a long period, and the absence of direct violence did not reduce the dangerousness of the conduct, when the psychological and physical consequences to the victim were clear and enduring. In rejecting mitigation, the jury stressed that the persistent maintenance of control over a long period indicated a higher level of dangerousness than impulsive acts, as it reflected a deliberate will to continue violating the law despite the consequences to the victim. The federal court's verdict served as a clear affirmation that sophisticated forms of detention, those leaving no obvious traces of violence, are still regarded as serious violations of human rights and will be severely punished when proven by a consistent chain of evidence. The 35-year prison sentence closed the legal proceedings, clearly affirming the stance of the federal justice system that individual liberty cannot be violated by any form of control, even without visible physical violence, when that conduct is deliberate, prolonged, and causes profound difficult to fully recover harm. However, when the verdict was announced, the story of the case did not end in the courtroom, but shifted to the long-lasting consequences in real life, where Charles Walker's recovery process opened a different, more complex and slower chapter. This included treatment for chronic malnutrition, rehabilitation of weakened, atrophied muscles and joints, readaptation to natural light, and intensive psychological therapy to confront PTSD, sleep disorders, submissive reflexes, and the persistent feeling of loss of control. Experts noted that Charles's recovery did not follow a straight line, but included periods of stagnation, recurring anxiety, and social avoidance, reflecting the profound impact of prolonged control on his psychological structure, where rebuilding a personal sense of safety had to start from the most basic elements. The psychological impact on Charles's family was also assessed as serious and enduring, as loved ones had to face feelings of guilt for having once accepted the presumed dead conclusion. The inner conflict between the joy of reunion and the pain of realizing the extent of the suffering Charles had endured, and the difficulties in re-establishing family relationships that had been interrupted for so long. These relationships required gradual adjustment, with psychological support provided to the entire family to address secondary trauma, where memories of the disappearance and the return in a state of extreme debilitation became a new source of stress. From a community safety perspective, the case raised the need to assess the risk of other potential victims who may have been approached or controlled by Raphael Moore in the past, based on his demonstrated capacity for long-term detention, spatial control rights, and behavioral pattern, indicating the ability to maintain isolation without detection over an extended period. Authorities conducted reviews of Raphael's prior relationships, residential history, and personal activities to determine whether there were any signs of repeated behavior or suspicious contacts with vulnerable individuals, focusing particularly on those who had briefly gone missing but lacked sufficient evidence at the time to open criminal files. In parallel with the risk assessment, a review of related missing persons files was launched to cross-reference unsolved cases in the areas and time periods when Raphael could have been present, concentrating on disappearances that left no signs of accident, no body, and shared similarities in personal circumstances or disappearance environment, although this review was precautionary and did not presume the existence of other victims. During this process, files were re-examined from a new perspective, emphasizing the possibility of nonviolent unlawful detention, a model that had previously often been overlooked or underestimated in prolonged missing persons cases. Legally, the case file was closed after all prosecutorial procedures were completed, the sentence took effect, and no appeals remained within the prescribed time frame, marking the official end of the case in the judicial system, though it did not mean the real-world consequences had ceased. Authorities archived the file as a typical example of prolonged detention through spatial and psychological control, to serve as training material and reference in future investigations, thereby improving the ability to recognize similar cases that may be concealed under the guise of voluntary or no violence. For Charles, his current condition was described as a process of relearning autonomy, where every personal decision, from choosing living spaces to establishing relational boundaries, carried restorative meaning. Although the injuries could not be completely erased, medical, psychological and family support created a foundation for him to reintegrate into society at his own pace. For the family and the community, the case left a clear realization that disappearance does not always end in death, and that sophisticated forms of control can exist for long periods without detection, if the search focuses only on visible signs of violence. Closing the legal file therefore held administrative and judicial significance, while the human consequences of the case continued to exist as a reminder of the long-term price of depriving individual liberty, not only for the direct victim, but also for the family, the community, and the social system that had once believed the story had ended many years earlier. The story of Charles Walker is not just a criminal case closed with a 35-year prison sentence for Raphael Moore, but also a profound warning for life in the United States today, where the concept of personal safety is often equated with the absence of overt violence. Charles was not kidnapped at gunpoint, not chained, and not locked behind bars, yet he was deprived of his freedom for many years through spatial control, information restriction, and survival dependency. This reflects a sobering reality. In modern society, individual liberty can be violated quietly, subtly, and over a prolonged period, while the surrounding community remains completely unaware. From Charles's family being forced to accept the presumed dead conclusion, to the way Raphael exploited geographic isolation, gaps in oversight, and his own social breakdown to sustain the detention, the story shows that protective systems are only effective when we correctly understand the true nature of the risks. The key lesson here is not to judge safety solely by surface signs. In American life, where many people live isolated, work freelance, and travel alone, maintaining social connections, transparency in personal information, and vigilance toward controlling relationships is essential. At the same time, the legal system and the community need to take nonviolent forms of control more seriously, as in Charles's case, so that victims who are still alive but effectively erased from society are not overlooked. This story reminds us that freedom is not just the right to move about, but also the right to choose, to connect, and to be seen. And when any of these elements is deliberately stripped away, society has a responsibility to recognize it and intervene in time. If the story of Charles Walker has made you reflect on the value of freedom and the silent dangers in modern life, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring real cases together and the profound lessons behind each fate. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video with another story where the truth is brought to light so no one is forgotten in silence.